Okay, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Can everyone hear me okay, yeah? How many of you were in the last session? Can you put your hand up if you were in the last? Wow. Well done you for staying, on a beautiful day with great music, for staying in this discussion. But we are discussing the future of the world, so it's an important discussion we're having here with some great people. This session is, the whole day, for those of you who don't know, that we weren't here earlier, today's discussion is all about the world after Ukraine. A big rock has been thrown into a pond. Ripples are happening all over the world. And what we're going to be discussing today is how this is changing the world, how it's smashed a mirror, and what are the cracks? How are we going to put this mirror back together again? Or indeed, will we ever put it back together again? What's changing? This session, as I say, in this session, we're talking specifically about Europe. Now, there's no question that Ukraine has already changed Europe. So we've got two new European countries deciding to join NATO, Finland and Sweden. We've got energy policy, which was controversial in places like Germany for years, will suddenly changed. Suddenly, Germany decides it's going to increase its investment in NATO. Here in this part of the world, the Visegrad Four, which was pretty united in so many areas, has suddenly split apart over the issue of Ukraine. And at the same time, we have, in other parts of other countries in Europe, including my own, Britain, we have political turmoil, craziness. In Britain, we've got a crazy political situation now. Same is happening in Italy. The Prime Minister tried to resign, and the President said, no, you can't. In France, they're leading with a minority government. So Europe has got all sorts of issues going on, and Ukraine is at the center of many of them. Not all of them, but many of them. So that's what we're going to be discussing now. Looking ahead, how do these things play out? And I'm delighted to say that for the second time today, we have a former Czech foreign minister with us, who I'm sure you know and recognize here, Sasha Vondra. For those of you who don't know his biography, I'm sure you do, but let me just quickly introduce him. Not only was he very involved in Charter 77 way back, but, and he's, as I said, a former foreign minister, defense minister, Czech ambassador to the United States. He was foreign policy advisor to Havel way back in the early 1990s. He founded the Občanská Forum after the Velvet Revolution. Did I pronounce that correctly? Okay. And of course, as you know, very involved, senior member of the ODS party here in the Czech Republic. So we're very delighted to have him as part of this discussion. And we've also got Matt Steinglass here. Matt is the Europe correspondent for the Economist magazine. So he covers Europe, but he's also studied Russia at Harvard. He's worked in large parts of the world with the Economist. And hold on. You haven't got the most interesting fact yet, which is that he's also, and we can talk about this too if you want to, a very renowned writer of children's animation on television. It was called Arthur.
There's probably some people in the audience here who saw some of the shows that I wrote when they were 6 years old. It's Arthur on PBS, yeah.
Anyone watched Arthur? Anyone remember Young After? Oh, wow, we've got some fans of Arthur. So if you want his autograph afterwards, he wrote those children's TV series. But that's not what we're here to discuss today. We're going to talk about Europe. So without further ado, let's go. And I am very keen to involve you in this discussion. Please don't just watch us, take part. So if at any point you want to say something, just put your hand up, and at some point I will try and come to you. We're not going to just wait to the end. If you want to make a point, you want to express an opinion, you want to ask a question about the things we're discussing, please don't come in with your own agendas. We're discussing certain things here today. But I'm very keen to hear from you. I'm particularly keen, I must say, to hear from women in the audience as well as men. We had a lot of men talking before. We're three guys. I particularly want to hear from women here today. So please, women, let's hear from you. So let's start just with an open question. So Ukraine, if I can start with you, Sondra, Ukraine and Europe. Just give us an overview of your view of how Ukraine has changed and it will change the European picture.
Okay, so hello everybody, good afternoon. I think, to respond this briefly, it certainly is changing and will change Europe. But before we would answer the question how it's gonna to change Europe, we have to ask or respond to questions before, because the problem is Europe, that Europe, what means mostly the European Union, in fact, I was getting ready for a certain kind of the world, which is gone, is what happened. So it took Europe, I would say, mentally unprepared for this kind of a war making, which we see in the East. Look, I am in, you mentioned briefly my curriculum here. I, as a person, I'm engaged in the foreign policy making since the early 1990s, when I started to work with Václav Havel. So I remember a lot, more than 30 years has passed since, and I do not remember during the whole era such a kind of a brutal interference with the elementary principles of the international law, with values, with a certain norms of behaving or rule of the games in the international affairs. Perhaps one situation was somehow similar, and that was in the summer 1990, when Saddam Hussein has attacked Kuwait and was trying to annex that. And it mobilized a huge activity of the UN, including the General Assembly of the United Nations. It led to the operation to liberate Iraq, which, because Iraq was to liberate Kuwait. And it was quickly done because Iraq was a small state. And then there was a large coalition composing almost everybody. So that was to some extent similar. In between, you could, many uses of force by this or that country, which could be somehow controversial, but at least was following, was done in the name of those values and principles and rule of the games. But this brutal attack by Russia on the Ukraine, that's something really different, because it was not provoked, it was not done in the name of those values. It was just, Putin briefly said no to the world which we were building on. And it led to the situation that, in the morning we were waking up, February, March, April, watching, what's gonna to happen, like Bucha and others, those massacres. We have reached rightly the conclusion that this is the act of the war criminal. But according to the rules of our world, we should go for him, to arrest him, to defeat him. But this is something what the Western world, neither Europe nor the United States, are willing to do, because Russia is a big power with the nuclear guns. So thus we are trying, to contain it by sanction. We are trying to help Ukraine by the gun deliveries, but we are not going for him. And thus, look what was the immediate reaction. The first vote in the UN, you know, we got the support, US, Japan, Australia, the usual suspect, Canada, but China, India, South Africa, they all abstained. Brazil, on the first vote, was with us. You know, many of you probably do not like Bolsonaro because what he's doing with the Amazonia, but at least here, he instinctively joined us as a kind of a cowboy. But once there was a second vote in the UN about the invasion, he was also in the category of abstention. So I do not like that, but Putin and Chinese and others, they were dreaming, you know, about transformation from Western-dominated world into a multipolar world. And our inability to contain this kind of a development right now will lead to the emerging multipolarity. To the world that will not be dominated by the values, principles, but by strength. It would be more a kind of a game of the physical forces. And this is something what Europe is totally mentally unprepared. You know, we appreciated that the first reaction, at least by the rhetorics and also by some deeds, there was extraordinary amount of the European unity among the major players. But it was a unity generated by the shock, what's happened, and by our inability to predict this kind of a development. So, you know, if we are under pressure, we are united. That's, you know that from your normal life. But there's a huge question how we would be able, you know, to keep that kind of a unity once, you know, we will have to undergo some measures which would be paying us more than just our words or our symbolic way of support. So I think that in this light, we should study, you know, how this is going to change Europe.
We will do. Thank you. What a great opening. Wow. You've set the context brilliantly. Matt spends his life looking at all the different aspects of Europe for The Economist. So same question to you, just an overview for you of how Ukraine is changing and will change Europe.
So the first thing that I wanted to say in response to, should I refer to you as Mr. Vondra? So you're a very informal guy, so maybe Sasha. I don't know what the best... Sasha is good, okay, good. So my immediate response was, Sasha is absolutely right that there was a sense of shock and inability to predict the level of violation of norms that we saw in Putin's invasion. At the same time, it's not clear to me why that was the case, because we saw what Russia did in Syria. They used chemical weapons to slaughter civilians. We saw the way that the Russian regime has been operating for the last 20 years. This is a guy who came to power probably by bombing apartment buildings containing Russian civilians. We know what kind of regime this is. And it's not entirely clear to me why the Western world was so shocked to see the way they behaved in Ukraine. It is true, though, that it has shifted the landscape in the EU. So the reason you've been staring at this for the last few minutes is because I put together a little quick presentation on my way up here. I passed through Krakow on the way here, and there's a very nice museum of contemporary art there. They have a good exhibition about political art going on at the moment. And two of the pieces really struck my fancy, that stimulated my imagination. Both pieces oriented towards the EU. And one of them is this piece by Michael Elmgreen and Ingar Dagset, Anger Management, the EU as a punching bag.
May I just suggest you speak a tiny bit slower?
Oh, yeah, sure, no, you're absolutely right, sorry.
People have English as a second language, and you
Yeah, no, you're right, it's not fair, and also not fair to the interpreters. I thought this piece was just it's a very sharp conceptual piece. The way that the EU has functioned as a punching bag for lots of different political forces outside the EU and inside the EU is really important. It's been a punching bag for British conservatives and for Brexiteers in general. It's been a punching bag for countries like Norway and Denmark. Norway as a strong conservative, actually not even entirely conservative, but there's a lot of anxiety in Norway about being too closely tied to the EU. In Denmark as well, there's a lot of anxiety over being pulled too closely to the center of the EU. And across other countries in Europe, we know about the Hungarians and the Poles, of course, have very strong populist right-wing movements that have been in power for the last decade or so, who both they both rely on antagonism towards the EU as part of their political support. But people often overlook the fact that even more stable, nominally pro-European countries like the Netherlands rely on blaming Brussels for political support. Anything that goes wrong is always the fault of Brussels. When European politicians, when European leaders talk to their own voters, they say, look at what I kept away from Brussels. Look at how much I achieved despite Brussels. Then they go to Brussels and they talk among themselves and they reach deals, and it's very productive. They know that they need the EU. And then they go back to their voters again and they play the same game. And the question is whether Ukraine has fundamentally changed that dynamic. And as Sasha was saying, there's an instantaneous response in this type of crisis in the EU of solidarity. Everybody pulls together. There's a tremendous level of political capital that's generated by these kinds of crises, as everyone recognizes that they can't stand on their own. Suddenly things become possible that were always considered impossible, acting together on energy policy. In the case of the COVID crisis, taking out collective European debt to finance the recovery. Suddenly it's possible. And that lasts for a while. And then it breaks down as normal politics intrudes, as the economy worsens, and we're going to have to see how that plays out in the case of Ukraine. But the second piece that really struck my fancy at that exhibition was this one, which in a way is a lot darker. It's a piece by a Polish artist named Paweł Kowalewski. This is a photo he took of a sign at the Nelson Mandela Museum in South Africa. And it's a preserved entrance from the commuter rail system in Pretoria from the apartheid days. When you're reminded that the way they referred to white people in apartheid South Africa was as Europeans, and that the meaning of the phrase Europeans only in that context was white people only, no black people, no coloreds, it makes you think about how we define this entity. What is Europe? That has been a going question ever since the earliest days of optimistic, idealistic conceptions of Europe as a zone of collective values, as a zone of peace. The first proposals for a united Europe by the Abbé Saint-Pierre in the early 1600s assumed that there was a kind of zone of European shared culture and European shared religion, and that you could make peace within that zone between warring sovereigns. And the question has always been, what is this zone? Is this a zone of people who are united because they're in the same place in the world? That seems, first of all, you don't know where to draw the line. Is Russia a part of it? Is Turkey a part of it? Is Ukraine a part of it? Nobody's quite sure. Is it a shared zone of religion? That's very uncomfortable. First of all, there are a whole lot of different kinds of Christianities. Secondly, that would exclude Muslims. We don't want to do that. Is it a zone of universal values? If it's a zone of universal values, what makes it any different from any place else in the world? Those kinds of arguments have been running for 300, 400 years, actually much longer. And the conflict in Ukraine is it's an iteration of that long-running question.
Okay, I'm going to bring you to that then. So let's move on. So given that the question is posing, what is the answer? What happened? Thank you for that. It's really interesting, isn't it? What happens as a result of Ukraine, in your view? Given the challenges there of European identity, how does Europe respond? Is there a Europe to respond? Is, I suppose, part of that question.
The conflict in Ukraine is the best kind of conflict to have over what Europe is. Because the real conflict that's going on in Ukraine is Ukraine got into this war because it tried to remove itself from the Russian sphere of influence. The Russian sphere of influence right now means kleptocracy, imperialism, corruption, oppression, autocracy. Russia attacked Ukraine because Ukraine tried to separate itself from that zone by joining the EU. And that is a conflict over the kinds of values that everybody in the EU ought to be able to stand behind.
That's interesting. Now, if I can come to you, Sasha, on that, because Lubomir Zarelek, who we heard earlier, you've raised the issue he raised, which is spheres of influence. What does that mean? How do you say that in Czech? So everyone's really clear what we mean by that. How do you say spheres of influence in Czech?
Sféra vlivu.
Oh, that's easy. Okay. So, thank you. So then Ukraine tries to break away, but actually Lubomir was saying that spheres of influence are a very real thing. You have to sometimes respect them because they exist. So how does Europe respond to, in your view, to what's happened in Ukraine? Should it in some ways respect this sphere of influence that Russia would claim to have?
No, look, if you ask somebody in this country, so we have learned a lot about the sphere of influence because we remember the Brezhnev doctrine, you know, that was the justification. In the name of the Brezhnev doctrine, the Soviets, Brezhnev himself has ordered the invasion into Czechoslovakia in 1968 because the country, you know, somehow lukewarm, but was trying, you know, to emancipate a bit from the Soviet sphere of the influence, and according to the rules of the games of the Cold War, at least in the interpretation of Kremlin, we did not have this right, so they made the invasion. And that was, I think, there were two elementary reasons why such an incredible amount of solidarity has appeared in this country with the Ukrainians, because really, you know, the people were open to help the million of refugees which were marching to the east. Incredibly, Czechs were collecting in a couple of days the donation, you know, by individuals to 1 billion crown just for the guns. Not for the humanitarian, to purchase the guns, to send them, that they would be able to defend themselves. So extraordinary amount of solidarity, in particular in the first weeks of this invasion. And it was first because the Czech had their own experience, you know, what does it mean? The politics of the sphere of the influence and claiming the territory, because I think in the case of Russia, it's not just, you know, that Putin would be afraid of the European Union expansion into Ukraine. It's a claim for the territory, at least for the territory what they called White Russia, Small Russia, and Donbass. They are convinced that it belongs to them, and that this era of independence, Ukraine, which we remember past 30 years, was just something, you know, some wrong current in the history, that they need to go back to Russian Empire. I don't know whether it was really interesting to read this essay which Putin has published last summer, 6 months before the invasion, because everything is included there. And look, I would even be betting that he wrote this himself, not just that, you know, this is a text of some advisor, because if you were listening his major speech just on the eve of the invasion, it was practically the same, and there was no ever single recognition that Ukraine is a nation, that Ukraine has a right for its
just for those that, what did he say?
So,
just to be clear, what did he say?
Our remembrance, maybe even together with, you know, because the Czechs missed the opportunity to defend themselves twice in the 20th century. We missed that opportunity in 1938, after the Munich Agreement, when we gave up. And then we missed that in 1968. Of course, it was difficult to defend. But suddenly Zelensky, to surprise of everybody here in the country, said to this American offer, you know, that the train is waiting for you to leave the country into exile. When he said, you know, I'm not interested in the train, I'm interested in the guns, the Czech immediately, by their own, started to collect the money to send them the guns. So, you know, that tells you something, you know, what we think about the sphere of influence claimed by the others.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to look forward, and then I want to involve. Are you coming forward because you want to ask a question? Great. Well, look, let's get you to do it. No, you don't have to come forward. Stay there. We'll bring a microphone to you. And thank you for coming and saying, I want to say something. Brilliant.
Thank you.
And you can speak in Czech if you prefer, and we'll ask them, but speak in English if you can.
I think I can do English. I would like to ask if, as you've spoken about the Czechs having the similar experience as Ukrainians right now, if there's a difference between, or what is the difference between the nations that are experiencing this? Because, as you said, Czechs have been under Russian influence before, but, for example, parts of Germany, France, and other nations more west, weren't. So is there a significant difference in the way the people...
the response, the reaction of countries who've had, particularly the Warsaw Pact countries?
Exactly, thank you.
That's a great question, thank you. Before we ask you that, are there any other people, while we're opening up, that want to ask a question or make a point, and we can introduce both of them? Anyone put your hand up if you have something you want to say? Please feel free. There's a lady at the back there. Let's just hear that, and then we'll come to the two guests to answer. So the first question is it the difference between former Soviet countries, their response, and other parts of Western Europe? And the lady at the back has a question or a comment. No, can we go to that lady there, please, at the back? No, the lady at the back. The lady at the back I point to with the colourful top on. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
I actually have two questions, but small ones.
Okay, we need to be short because we're going to get through a lot of stuff.
Yeah. So first of all, I wanted to ask, do you think that like reaction of Ukrainians right now, that they demand guns, not a capitulation, is because they already know from previous experiences from 2008 in Georgia and 2014 in Ukraine that actually they will not receive help from other countries, so they have to do it by themselves right now, right here. And second question is actually you mentioned Europe, Norway, and other countries, but what about Belarus, which is partially part of the conflict, but I have such a thing that people are forgetting what happened in 2020 when Belarusians were fighting against Lukashenko's regime and
they fought inside the country. That was an internal conflict and lost. Yeah, thank you. Right, I'm going to put those. I'm going to ask you both to be quite brief because I'd like to get through more questions if we can. Matt, because we just heard from Sasha. Matt, do you want to respond? Firstly, the difference between Warsaw Pact countries and Western Europe, and then the questions we just asked there. What are your thoughts on that?
It's definitely true that both countries that were in the Warsaw Pact and more generally countries that are closer to Russia have had a more correct take on what Russian aggression represents. And they've been, especially the Baltic states, have been warning the West for a long time that the way that they're attempting to deal with Putin is misguided. That the German, especially the German desire to strike deals with Russia is confused. And they were right. It apparently took an invasion to show everyone that they were right. In terms of Belarus, there's just a tremendous difference in the rules of the game when you're talking about things that are taking place by an opposition inside a sovereign country versus what you can do when it's a sovereign country that's been invaded. And I think that is 99% of the difference that you've seen in the Western response between Ukraine and Belarus.
What was the other question the lady at the back there asked? Thank you for being brief. You asked a first question, which was, I can't remember what it was now. You asked about Belarus. Sorry? Yeah, that's a great question. So, and actually, this is a really relevant question. So the question, you made this point to me, so you make the point. The difference also between not just what happened with Georgia, but the difference what happened in 2014 when Russia went into Crimea and no one helped. And then I wonder if you want to talk about that, Matt. Why did they decide we've got to stand up now this time?
It's also along the same lines. It remains a fact that Western countries, outside countries in general, are looking for the strength of resistance by a country before they come to its aid. One contrast that you didn't mention was between Afghanistan and Ukraine. That was being drawn constantly at the beginning of the invasion. If you can see that a people have a consciousness of themselves as a state, as an independent state, and that they're willing to die for that state, it makes all the difference to countries that are thinking about whether to supply them with support or not.
Brilliant. Sasha, I'm fascinated in your comments on those three questions. So,
I am, I'm now commuting with Brussels because I'm in the European Parliament, and in late February, early March, if you came to Brussels, there was an entirely different conversation among the young people, even in Brussels. They were watching soccer, they were watching football, while in Prague everybody was discussing the war. So I think it's a really huge difference to how much it's touched, the ordinary population by what's happened. And certainly with the Ukrainians, they are right that simply we left Georgians alone once they were attacked in 2008. We left the Ukrainians by Putin has steal the Crimea in 2014. Those, sanctions were just a symbolic event. I was talking, there was a moral alibi for the West that it's doing at least something, but it did not, in Kremlin they were laughing. So now the situation is different in a way that, it was such a brutal act that we could not simply ignore that. But again, we are not going against Putin. We started the sanctions, which are now serious, tough one, but we have reached the limit when the sanctions are paying us more than Putin because they have the holes, Chinese, Indians, as I told you, they are not joining us. So he had a chance to export those materials somewhere else. So the only way which left to us is to help them, the Ukraine, with the guns to win the war on their own.
Do you think they can win a war?
And we are not doing enough. Look, I was just, last week we had a debate in Brussels in the committees of the European Parliament on this. There was such a poor performance by one person, I don't want to name her, who's responsible for, bringing together some kind of a strategy. So I said to myself, look, there is it's a trillion of euro in English. It's billion in Czech, it's trillion in English, for those green projects. Let's take at least 1/10 of that, 100 billion euros, to declare the program of lend and lease, the same what Churchill did for what Roosevelt did for Churchill during the Second World War, when, Europe was already occupied by Germans, but still UK was fighting, but need the guns. Or at least what Joe Biden did now is this 30 billion US dollars. So Europe has much larger responsibility. So let's organize this. But, there's nothing like that. 3 billion euro, it's nothing. It's like a drop in the sea. So yes, let's open the program Lend and Lease by the European Union to create the shipment, the financial shipment, and that would be a way how the military industry would start to produce the ammunition and ship this to the Ukrainian.
Can I bring that to the question this man asked? Because actually, it wasn't this man, it was the lady over there. Because I want to move forward and see how this changes things. Do you think, in some way, in the EU then, this is the time that countries like the Czech Republic, Poland, maybe Hungary, other former Warsaw Pact countries, will actually take a lead in Europe? Is this going to change the dynamics within Europe? Because you're saying that, I suspect, whereas maybe France is not saying that, or, you know, I don't know whether Denmark is saying that, but you know what I mean?
I don't know whether to take the lead. They would not allow us to take the lead, but
in terms of the moral high ground.
No, but you are right in one sense that we took the initiative and we shaped the policy very much. So it was Peter Fiala trip to Kiev with Mateusz Morawiecki, the Polish Prime Minister. They were the first. And they really, we shaped the policy because we started to help them with the guns, with the political proposals from the day one. While, you know, the Germans, the French were still, you know, waiting. It was the Czechs, Poles, the Baltics, the Romanians too, Hungary, not so much, we all know that. But the mainstream and the most important countries in the East did the job together with the UK, with Boris Johnson.
Yeah.
And now they lost Boris, the Ukrainians, as the important advocate, so it's mostly on our shoulders. And we know that because, look, there is one change which will change one of those effects, what this war will have, that this is the end of this zone of nobody in between Russia and Europe. You know, the buffer zone, historically. Sweden, Finland are going to join NATO. Belarus, on the other hand, is fully back in the Russian sphere. And now, you know, the key question is where the Ukraine will be. Whether it's win the war and whether we will help the country to advocate its position with us, because there won't be any buffer zone. If we leave Ukraine behind, then Putin will eat it, or the next Russian Tsar will consume this during the next opportunity. That's pretty clear.
I'm interested, Matt, as you know, you look at this. Matt, a reminder, is the Europe editor of The Economist. You look at these things from, you know, from a different above. Do you see a different dynamic in the EU that may last as a result of this, of what we've just heard is happening?
I think it's a different dynamic in the way that each of these crises creates different dynamics. Things change, and there's a backlash, and there's unity, and then there's dissent. And it is a different dynamic, but it doesn't mean that blockages are just swept away. There are still tensions, disagreements, and those get worked out. But more specifically, I mean, I'm not sure that the blockage to Western military support to Ukraine at the moment is a financial blockage. It's mostly the Germans having inexplicable hesitations about actually shipping the heavy weapons that they said that they would ship. It doesn't seem like there's a lack of money for weapons, or there may be, but it's not. That's not the key. That's not the key choke point. There will be lack of money for reconstruction, for financing the budget deficit. The European pledges for financing the Ukrainian budget deficit are lagging a little bit behind where they ought to be. It would be nice if they would guarantee those forward a year or so to give business confidence that
Can I ask a specific question? Do you think Europe, EU, really, we mean Europe, and Britain actually, that's another question about Britain and the EU in this, but the EU will step up in that you were just saying they need to step, I mean, America's putting tens of billions in. Why? I don't know why if I was an American taxpayer. Because
European taxpayers, because Americans have a very different attitude towards debt and towards defense. I mean, right. It's both of those things. Americans are much freer. The American voter has no idea what the actual budget deficit is. It's not really a concern in American politics.
Let's not go there, but will the EU step up?
And in terms of defense, Europe has just a deeply embedded reluctance to do anything related to defense. In some ways, it looks inexplicable to me. If you look at polling right now, there's a new poll yesterday of German voters and their attitudes towards a possible recession and supporting Ukraine. Should we continue to support Ukraine even if it hurts the economy, causes inflation, and so forth? 83% of SDP voters, so Scholz's party, the German center left, say support Ukraine. But the party is hesitant. And it's as if there are instincts that are ingrained in the German political. I mean, I don't know how you see this with German colleagues, but it feels as though they have these sort of leftover Ostpolitik instincts that are very hard to lose, even when their voters are ahead of where they want to be. And I think, just to answer that last question, probably Germany is the key player still, because they're the ones whose economy is deeply threatened by the disappearance of cheap Russian energy. And they have been the economic motor of Europe. And yeah, that's the huge question.
Well, let's look at Germany. You have a lot of experience with the German relations, Sasha. So Germany, talk us through the position of Germany as you see it going forward now. They've suddenly changed their policy on defense, on energy, they say. And what's your view of the German role going forward and how this will affect the EU?
I think, they changed some rhetorics, but still, I think that they have a grand debate ahead of themselves because, yes, Putin is the one who brought us largely into this kind of a mess with energy sector, but the German contribution to this, it's, major one, because it was them who brought us to this, this total dependence on the Russian gas. For example, I remember when we had the last EU presidency in 2009, we were fighting, for having a diversification of the gas supply. So there was a Nabucco pipeline project, which was supposed to bring 35 billion cubic meters of the gas into Central Europe from Caspic region, from Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan. We had already the agreement with them. We had the agreement with Turkey as a transit country. We had the agreement with the European Commission to finance this, and we had even the private consortium to build it. But then the Germans approached the leading member of the consortium, which was RWE, you all know that company, and forced RWE to withdraw because they were afraid of the competition onto Nord Stream. So look, that's where we are. Yes, now Germany has to pay the bill too because they are really afraid of the social consequences of the energy crisis, because, Germany, that's not a revolutionary country like France. They are not striking every week like French airlines. But once, the popping pot has not the control mechanism how to put the vapor out of the pot, then it can be a really problem, detonation.
When they go, in other words.
And okay. I think, this is the last thing what we wish, the German detonation. So, yes, I hope that they will learn some lessons from the recent history and will change that. There are some politicians who, like, for example, Minister Habeck is a very talented guy who understands that. But SPD, they have a defense minister, she is a woman, and she is effectively blocking the deliveries of arms to Ukraine. So I think we are far from having Germany transformed. It's in the middle.
Just briefly, I've got a couple of questions. I want to come to you guys, but just on Germany for a moment. Look, I want to go ahead. I want to move ahead a year, 2 years, 3 years. Is Germany stronger or weaker within its role in the EU? Because Germany, before Ukraine, it felt like France was weakening in its position in the EU. Germany was suddenly becoming more assertive. This has changed everything. I want to understand how you see the dynamics going forward.
I think, we will be facing another major crisis in the fall, I would say. And that's because of the inflation. In Germany, inflation, it's something like a nightmare. It's a memory to Weimar. And the inflation is growing everywhere. But while American Fed, the Czech central bank, Polish central bank, and others, they are raising the interest rate to fight the inflation, European Central Bank is doing nothing yet. And it means that, why? Because, to raise the interest rates means to protect the German saving, but on the other hand, means, to cause a major problem with the debt, with the countries with the huge debts, like Italy, Spain, to some extent also France. And, that's the dilemma, whether to fight the inflation but risk the division of the Eurozone, or to protect the Eurozone as a whole, but the German taxpayers will pay the price. And that's, something what I do not know, how it's going to be responded. We remember the last major crisis in the Eurozone, North and South divide. That's, in fact, religion is not what unites us in Europe, because North is the Protestant, so it's a public confession. So the better fiscal order, the South is Catholic, and I am Catholic too. So, it's a non-private confession, so you can be a bit more sinner. And thus, in economy, it is transformed into the huge deficit. So the question is how this is going to be fixed, because the last crisis was a major one, and it was just Greece, small, unimportant states at stake. But now you will have big Italy, big Spain. So you should know, what the Germans are going to do. I don't know.
Before we come to that, Matt, I'm keen to get questions. I know there's a guy over there, but you asked a question before, sir, so I'm keen to get someone I haven't heard from. Lady here, and then I'll come to you, sir, over there. Lady just in the middle here with the black top. Can we get a microphone to her, please, quickly? Thank you. Okay, just in the middle there. Let's have another microphone ready for the gentleman over here, please. Can we get a second mic over there so we haven't got much time. I want to get as many people as I can. Yeah.
Okay, so this panel is called Europe after Ukraine. I'm going to ask a little bit of a different question. Can you talk a little bit about the food crisis with regards to the Russian-Ukrainian war, with grain not getting...
I'm going to stop you. We're going to talk about other issues later. Today, this panel is talking about Europe and Ukraine. So that's really the only thing we're going to have questions about. So do you want to ask anything about Europe and Ukraine?
I just wanted to ask if Europe is ready for another refugee crisis.
Got it. That's a great question, thank you. So we've got that question. I appreciate it. I don't want to go off track, but that is a very relevant question. And there's a gentleman over there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for calling on me again. So I've lived here for 17 years. When I first moved...
Speak slower.
When I first moved to the Czech Republic, this country voted down voiceably the idea of a radar base, an American radar base. The last discussion was about spheres of influence. For the European Union to truly show its muscle, it might need a European Union army. I know there's been discussions. NATO is not that. And I wonder how long this crisis brought new members into NATO. That's fantastic. But I wonder how long continental Europeans are going to want those strings pulled by the major financer, which is Washington,
or even the Americans will continue to finance it, is the other question. Two great questions.
Thank you.
Because I want to get more questions in, I want to... Big, massive questions, quick, So the first question, Matt, to you, is... We've just had a load of refugees into Europe, already causing strains, even though, they're Ukrainians and their cousins and so on. And are we ready with the food crisis is going to cause another big refugee crisis. We'll talk more later when we talk about Africa. There's an African session. We'll discuss that very point in more detail. Is Europe ready for this refugee crisis? Let's start with that one.
No.
Okay.
Europe is doing fine as long as the refugees are white and Christian. And it is still having a lot of trouble assimilating immigrants who are not white and or not Christian. And that is an economic shame because Europe actually needs more workers. The population is shrinking. Part of the reason for inflation is, particularly in Poland, is a wage price spiral that's caused by labor shortages. They were receiving huge numbers of Ukrainians pouring in to work for them. At some point, hopefully those Ukrainians will go back because Ukraine will be at peace. Then they won't have Ukrainians to work for them anymore. Anyway, the point is Europe needs workers, and being permanently opposed to having a lot of new people coming in is economically misguided. So that's a shame.
Can it cope with millions of refugees, let's say, from starving Africa? We've had millions come in from Ukraine. Germany took 1 million from Syria. Can it cope with that number of people?
No, especially, particularly if the economic situation is not, if the economic situation is even worse than it was in 2015, which it's looking like it will be in the foreseeable future, that would be politically ruinous, and Europe will, Frontex will block those people at the borders, and it will be terrible.
So fascinated, Sasha. Visegrad 4 was formed in part about the whole refugee. With the 4 countries that didn't want all these immigrants coming in, we're not going to take our share. I would say, what's your view of Europe's ability to take in potentially millions of refugees who are starving because there's no wheat?
Well, I think, the Ukrainians are in a massive number everywhere, from Poland to Hungary, to Romania, to the Czech Republic. Yes, look, there was a different public stance if you compare this 2015 crisis with this year crisis. I think, yes, all are human beings. That's simply a matter of truth. Either, if you are escaping from Syria or elsewhere, or if you are escaping from Ukraine. But this changing attitude, I think, firstly was generated, no doubts, is easily to integrate the Ukraine here. That's the way how the people are approaching this differently. And they were also, in a different way, were approaching the risk factor which are connected with that, like security. The Ukrainians, it's not a security threat, but with some Muslims, it is a security threat.
Is it
all of them, but with some, it is a security factor in the game. And
Russian spies and the Ukrainians.
Okay.
Well, it's different if they place the bomb into the autobus, It's simply the matter of truth. And, ask the people. And, you need the cooperation of the general public towards this. You need it. Without the cooperation of general public, it's just a road, that the domestic politics would be dominated by the extremists. And I don't want to be Czech Republic dominated by the extreme forces. So, and then last but not least, the people have seen also the difference, that simply here was a steam flow of the people, women, children, and seniors. We all see that. While, in 2015, it was also young people, marching in front of that, who I expect should be fighting against the Islamists in Syria instead of going here. Exactly the same what the young Ukrainians men are doing there in Ukraine. They are defending their country with the guns against the Russian invasion and sending their families, women, kids, and the grandfathers here.
We're not going to have a debate from the floor. Sasha, though, I've just got to say to you guys, you've got to be aware, we've still got this Europeans only thing above us, which is quite ironic. So one quick question on that, and then I want to we've got only limited time. That may be the Syrian situation, but I suppose the unspoken thing is if 3 million Africans who are not fighting Islamists decide they've got no bread, no food, and they're going to head for Europe, come what may, how does Europe respond? Not just Czech, which is, I'm sure, going to be, but Europe responds to that.
No, fine. We have more and more of them here everywhere in Europe, and I'm fine, with that. To some extent, because there is some kind of absorption capacity. You cannot accommodate 10, 20 millions. Israel, which is very pro-immigrant, if you're counting the Jews, has also some kind of absorption capacity in the highest peak, when the Russian Jews were coming into Israel, which is about 8 million people, almost like us. So they were able to accommodate 200,000 in a year. Yeah. So there are some limits. And the fact is, you ask about this food crisis, how it's influenced Europe. I have a lot of Italian friends in the European Parliament, And that was exactly the moment when they started to take note of this crisis in the Ukraine. They did not take care so much, because of the invasion, but after 3-4 weeks, suddenly spaghetti were outside of the stores.
Amazing.
And they started to be really afraid of the food shortages, not just in Italy, because they have to import the flour, but also the impact in Africa, of course, and raising the large wave of the migration, not 4 million like of the Ukrainians marching here, but maybe 40 million from Africa, and that's a different number.
Just because of time, big question, we could have a whole hour on that. The other question, headlines please, because I want to get some other questions in. European army, is this dynamic going to move towards Europe? Firstly, Europe spending more money on defense, and secondly, will there be any pressure for a European army?
Yes, there already is a lot more spending on defense. That's going to continue. There really has been a mood shift. I think that's Kasha to back me up on that, but I think there's been a major shift.
So again, I didn't catch that. So
there's been a major shift in mood. The politics are different. There's going to be a lot more European defense spending. Commitments have been made. Those commitments will be partially realized. That's real. The European army thing is Europe shouldn't have a European army as a serious defense planning perspective. The European army is a headline that people in Brussels like to use to enhance the internal prestige of EU organizations, but no one in nobody that I know of who's a serious defense planner in any defense department across Europe thinks it would be a good idea. It would be subject to 1 million veto points. It wouldn't be able to act effectively. That doesn't mean, NATO is extremely effective. NATO is an alliance of lots of different armies. It has a long history of coordination. It takes a long time to build up that coordination. Yeah, it's a better solution than something like a European army.
Could there be a European foreign policy? I mean, there's a European foreign minister now. I know, but is there really a European foreign policy? I mean, for the same issues or not?
It runs into the same issues that everything in Europe runs into. You have to learn to live with the EU that actually exists. It can make some coherent plans together and execute those. It's never going to feel like a single government with a single foreign policy. It's always going to be a big lift to get European consensus and then eventually pursue European foreign policy goals. Okay. I mean, to add one little thing though, it was EU people standing on the barricades in Maidan in 2014 at the beginning of this whole thing that moved the conflict forward. That does happen. Europe makes commitments that it can't quite live up to, and the world changes, and then Europe is stuck with the consequences. I don't even think that's necessarily a bad thing. That's Europe throwing itself forward and trying to adjust to what happens afterwards.
Well, you're in the heart of Europe's actually.
Generally, I agree, yes, if you would judge this according to textbook rules, according to theory, yes, now it's the time, to build Europe stronger, to be able to compete in this global clash of the various poles of the power. But with the army, I think I'm very glad that we still have a functioning NATO. If you read the NATO responses to the current conflict, including, the enforcement of the Eastern Wing, it's great. It's great, finally. And it's doing much more than the EU in this respect. So with the European army, they are starting, the discussion how to build this from the roof. But, you need to start this from the basement, You need to have the people willing to fight. You need to have the resources to allocate in the armed forces. You need to purchase the quality guns. Then, you can hire the generals and build the institution. But, the wrong attitude is that we are trying to build this from above, not from below. Once we will take it seriously, and you will see this with, comparing the military spending of the major European countries like Italy, Spain, or Germany, then we can start to discuss seriously, but now it doesn't make a sense.
It raises the whole question, as someone who's British, about the role of Britain in this, because we are actually, Britain's probably the most powerful European power anyway, still right now, comparable with France, certainly, at least, arguably. But we won't go there now because we've run out of time. Unfortunately, I've got more questions, but we have run out. I hope you found that as really interesting and informative and as exciting as I did. The next session in 15 minutes, we're going to go back with another former Czech foreign minister. We've got a lot of former Czech foreign ministers here today. Lubomir Zaorálek, who was here before, and we've got Jakub Zanto, the Czech foreign, I'm sure you all know him from the television. He's going to be here talking specifically about how the Czech Republic, the new president of the EU, needs to respond and lead perhaps Europe in its response to Ukraine. But for now, please join me in saying thank you very much to these two guys for this discussion.